Today's build is all about dots, damage over time abilities. We're going to be poisoning and we're going to be bleeding our enemies to death and striking them with fast rapier hits for huge amounts of damage. So, let's go. Hello, this video is sponsored by no one. Subscribe, I guess. Let's go. The bow and the rapier go together like PB and J because they both stack with dexterity primarily, which is going to be our attribute later on, and they give you tons of flexibility in combat whether you want to stay at ranged or dive into melee range and deal damage that way. The main focus of this build is to apply these damage over time effects, being the poison damage from poison shot, the bleeding damage from the rain of arrows, and the bleeding damage from Tondo, which is a rapier skill. We are going to be combining these to do consistent damage over time abilities to all of these enemies, and when you do need to slice and dice enemies with the rapier in close range, you can still do that with some of the other abilities we have picked. This build is very high single target damage, and it does do a solid AoE damage because of rain of arrows and because of poison shot, and you can often get some of those cleave damage with your rapier in as well. This build is primarily focused on expeditions and leveling. This is not a PvP build at all. This build will not succeed well in PvP. I am working on a PvP build, but this is just for leveling and expeditions primarily. Especially against bosses, this build does really well against bosses because you can constantly keep applying those damage over time effects. You can get behind them, deal guaranteed critical hits, and just overall have a really good time. Let's put this build together, and we're going to start with weapon masteries. Now, we're going to focus on around the level 10 mark for your weapon masteries because this is a leveling build, though I'll give you some options of how you can progress this build into the end game. Firstly, with the bow, we're going to start with rain of arrows, and what that does is it shoots a barrage of arrows 7 meters wide, and it deals a certain amount of damage depending on your buffs. The main thing you want to do with this immediately is pick up barbed arrow, which with rain of arrows causes bleed damage, dealing damage over time as well. You obviously want to try and land this attack on as many enemies as possible so that you can apply the bleed damage and that initial damage that comes from the arrows hitting the ground. The next ability is poison shot, and what this does is it shoots a poison arrow which creates a poison cloud around wherever you have landed that does poison damage to those enemies for a period of time. We're also upgrading this to get infected arrows so that your poison shots deal extra damage for that additional time. I think it's 20 seconds that the attack lasts for. Your third ability is up to you. Now, I could see going evade shot, and I'd have used it primarily for the leveling time with this build. However, in expeditions, penetrating shot is probably better because it does deal a decent amount of damage. You can cleave multiple enemies with this by shooting it through enemies, whereas you're not really going to be using either of these abilities very often. You're mostly going to be just popping rain of arrows and poison cloud, then switching to your rapier to follow up with attacks with that, but I found penetrating shot to be a good option. There isn't a lot of decent passives to worry about as you are leveling. The main one you want to pick up is evasive tactics. So after you dodge, you deal 20% more damage for 5 seconds. So every time you try and get an attack off with your bow, you want to try and dodge first, get that buff, and then land that attack. It actually is a huge damage bonus to be able to do this. As you do level up your bow, you do want to pick up the passives for the abilities that you have got, as well as some of the passives in the hunter line, and I'll flick that up here as a rough guide of where you can take this build as you get later into the game. And for the rapier, we're primarily focusing on the bloodline and specifically the Tondo ability. So you slash your weapon very rapidly and it applies a bleed effect to pretty much everything in front of you in kind of like an arc in front of you. We are going to be buffing this by picking up Thirst for Blood. So when applying the first bleed stack to an opponent, this cooldown is reduced, and cooldown reducing is a big bonus to have. We are also picking up Flurry, which is a quick succession of 5 thrust attacks, which will deal a decent amount of damage, especially with the rapier. As you keep leveling it up, it will deal a lot of damage. It's a great way to get behind enemies, guarantee critical hits, and deal a lot of burst damage to them very quickly. But the main one you want to pair with Tondo is Flourish and Finish. Flourish performs an attack knocking back enemies, and pressing the light attack at the end of a flourish will initiate Finish, and Finish lunges forward and consumes your rapier bleeds to the target, dealing extra damage to them. So you want to make sure that you have Tondo effective on the enemy and then finish them off with this attack, and you'll deal a lot of damage. Similar to the bow, you do want to be picking up the passives for your main abilities, though I would highly recommend to pick up Unearring so you deal additional damage to targets that have your rapier bleed applied to them. It's 5% extra damage for free because you're always going to have your bleed effect active on the enemies. And I'll flick up a rough guide of where you want to progress this build as you go. Now for your attributes, it's not a big surprise here. We are focusing pretty much solely on the dexterity line because both of these weapons stack with dexterity. At 100, you get a 5% bonus to all thrust damage, and both the bow and the rapier are thrust weapons. So on top of all of the dexterity scaling you get for having these weapons, you just get a flat bonus 5%. So it's just a good time all around. I would also suggest to get your constitution to 50, not only for the extra health, because we will spend a lot of time in melee range, but also for the extra 20% to consumables. It's a great thing to always have. Your gear focus for this build will be on medium armor, primarily because there is no health regen with this build. There is no way to get your health back. You know, I did say in my Reaper build that you could go light armor because there's a lot of health regen you can get from the Reaper abilities. In this build, there is no health regen. So you want to be mindful of that. That's probably why you want to go medium armor. You'll still get the 10% extra damage for wearing medium armor, and you can still be a little bit more tanky and take some of those hits in the dungeons and expeditions and leveling if you do choose to. Of the Ranger is the main set you want to focus on, though of the Brigade is also good. Of the Ranger just gives you a huge amount of dexterity, and of the Brigade gives you dexterity and constitution. Both of these sets are primarily what you want to focus on, though there are tons of sets that give you dexterity, so there's plenty to choose from here. Let's cover how to play this build overall. So when you're starting combat, you want to start out with rain of arrows and poison shot to apply your bow's damage over times, then switch to your rapier, pop Tondo for the bleed effects on the enemies. You've got a ton of bleed and damage over time abilities applying. Then you can just swing your rapier around, use flurry on targets that you want to just finish off, and then use flurry and finish on targets that you want to detonate your bleeds from to deal that extra bit of damage. Keep an eye on your bow cooldowns here so that you can pop rain of arrows and poison shots as soon as they come up. When you're leveling out in the world, I typically run evade shot rather than penetrating shot, just for the quick range damage bonus that you get to finish off enemies and keep that distance. You can often kill enemies before they even get to you by using the shift to dodge to increase your damage, then just popping arrows into them. You can kill them before they get to you, which is really valuable as you get to some of the higher levels when sometimes taking hits from enemies are a bad idea. But this build still performs well because you can deal a lot of AoE, you can deal all of these damage over time effects, and then just kind of kite enemies around. You don't have to stay within range of them. It's a really fun build to play with. Some tips and tricks for this build. There is no health regen as we discussed, so make sure you're camping often around where you are going to be questing. Carry a ton of potions so you can heal yourself very quickly, and always stock up on arrows. Whether you're buying them from the trading post or you're crafting them yourself, always keep arrows on you. They're super cheap on the trading post if you do want to buy them or just craft them yourself. There is plenty of ways that you can get them, and you will find some in chests throughout the world as well, just to keep you stocked up. Avoid taking direct damage when you are in expeditions. You don't want to be anywhere near the tank. You can want to be trying to get behind enemies, not only for the guaranteed critical hits, but so that those enemies don't hit you with their wide swings, because we don't have a whole lot of health with this build, but we are going to spend a bit of time in melee range. And as mentioned, this is not a PvP build. This is only for PvE. If you were playing in PvP, you probably want to spend more time down the hunter line for the bow, as well as the grace line for the rapier, for things like repose, so that you can stun enemies and deal damage back to them. But this is a PvE build dealing damage of over time, which is really good in expeditions primarily, and it's a really good build to play around with leveling. Also, if you're struggling with collecting Asoth, I have a video specifically about how to farm Asoth, so go check that out if you're looking for it. Please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch. Thank you to our glorious members for supporting this channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.